Power never stands alone. It organizes quietly through systems most people never see. You just came from the Epstein case, the private jets, the sealed names, the island where influence and access blurred into something far more disturbing than anyone expected. But pause for a second and look at it differently. Epstein wasn't the center of anything. He was an exposure point, a rare moment where something usually hidden became visible. Because when the cameras left, nothing actually stopped. The meetings didn't stop. The relationships didn't disappear. The same individuals who appeared in public spaces continued operating in private ones, in environments where decisions are made without documentation, without transparency, and often without consequence. This isn't speculation. Private networks have always existed, especially among people with shared power, wealth, or influence. Closed-door meetings, policy discussions before public announcements, financial relationships that never reach headlines. These are established realities. And if you've ever paid attention to how certain outcomes seem to align too perfectly, how the same names appear across industries, governments, and institutions, then you've already noticed something. Not proof, not confirmation, but a pattern. If you're trying to understand what really sits behind stories like this, make sure you're subscribed, because this goes a lot deeper than headlines ever will. This didn't start with Epstein. That was just the moment it became visible to the public. A surface crack in something much older. Because if a network like that could exist in modern times, then it raises a much more uncomfortable question. How far back do these systems go? Power doesn't need visibility to function. In many cases, it works better without it. And history shows that influence has always found ways to operate quietly, especially when the stakes are high enough. So if private influence has always existed, the real question isn't whether it exists now. It's how long it has been operating without being fully understood. To understand that, you have to go back, not to rumors or speculation, but to documented history. Bavaria, 1776. A professor named Adam Weishaupt founded a group known as the Illuminati. His goal was not chaos, but control over ideas, promoting Enlightenment thinking in opposition to religious and political authority at the time. The structure was deliberate. Members operated under aliases. So communication was encrypted. There were ranks, initiation systems, and a clear objective: to influence institutions from within rather than confront them directly. Universities, government positions, intellectual circles. The strategy was quiet infiltration, not public revolution. For nearly a decade, the group expanded. It wasn't massive, but it was organized. And more importantly, it was intentional about how influence could be applied indirectly, not through force, but through positioning. That idea, influence without visibility, is what makes this historically relevant. Because even after the organization itself became a target, the model it represented did not disappear. It demonstrated something simple but effective. Power doesn't always need to be visible to be effective. And once that idea exists, it doesn't need the original group to survive. By 1785, the Bavarian government had outlawed the Illuminati. Raids were conducted, documents were seized, members were identified. Adam Weishaupt fled into exile. Officially, the organization ceased to exist. On record, that's where the story ends. But historically, secret societies rarely leave behind clean endings. What often disappears is not the concept, but the structure. Groups dissolve, but methods persist. Networks fragment, but connections remain. There was no large-scale public trial, no complete exposure of every member, no full mapping of how far influence had reached. just a series of actions that ended the visible organization. And that distinction matters, because when something disappears without full transparency, it doesn't confirm destruction. It confirms absence of visibility. Historians treat it as a concluded chapter, and based on available records, that's accurate. But what remains relevant is not whether the group continued. It's that the model existed at all. A system where influence is built quietly, applied indirectly, and protected by its own lack of visibility. That idea didn't require the original name to continue. Move forward to modern times, and the pattern becomes easier to recognize, not because it is hidden better, but because it operates in more structured environments. There are documented examples of private gatherings where influential individuals meet without public oversight. One example is Bohemian Grove, a long-standing private retreat where political leaders, executives, and cultural figures meet annually. The event is not secret in existence, but what happens within it is largely private. No media coverage, no recordings, no public transcripts of discussions. Another example is the Council on Foreign Relations, an organization that brings together policymakers, business leaders, and analysts to discuss global issues. Its influence is acknowledged, but its internal discussions are not fully visible to the public. These are not hidden organizations. They are real, documented institutions, and they illustrate a consistent pattern. People with influence tend to organize in private environments where decisions can be shaped before they become public. That alone doesn't prove conspiracy, but it does confirm structure. And when you begin to see multiple structures operating in similar ways across different sectors, it raises a reasonable question. How interconnected are they? Then there are the symbols, not as proof, but as repetition. The eye of providence, the unfinished pyramid, geometric patterns that appear across different institutions, currencies, and cultural outputs. Individually, each one has a documented origin, often unrelated to modern interpretations. For example, the eye of providence appears on the Great Seal of the United States, adopted in 1782, symbolizing divine oversight. The pyramid represents strength and duration. These meanings are historically recorded, but over time, these symbols have been reinterpreted, especially in discussions surrounding hidden influence and secret societies. Some point to their recurrence across different domains, architecture, media, corporate branding, and question whether the repetition is coincidental or intentional. There is no single piece of evidence that connects all of these uses. But the discussion exists because the pattern exists. And once people begin to notice patterns, they start asking questions. What becomes more relevant than any single group or symbol is how influence actually functions in modern systems. It rarely operates through direct control. Instead, it moves through networks. Political influence connects to financial systems. Financial systems connect to corporate interests. Corporate interests connect to media. Media shapes public perception, and public perception influences outcomes. These are observable relationships. What makes them complex is not their existence, but their overlap. Individuals often operate across multiple sectors simultaneously, creating connections that are not always visible at a surface level. And this is where the idea of a network becomes more practical than the idea of a single controlling entity. Not one organization directing everything, but multiple groups with aligned interests, operating in ways that reinforce each other. The Epstein case demonstrated how one individual could operate within such a system, using access and relationships to maintain position for years. That doesn't define the entire system, but it reveals how parts of it can function. So the question isn't whether secret societies control the world. That's too simple. The more relevant question is how influence is structured and how much of that structure is visible. Because history shows that power adapts. It becomes less obvious, more distributed, more difficult to trace. It moves away from individuals and towards systems. The original Illuminati existed. That is documented. It ended, at least officially. That is also documented. What remains is the idea it represented. Influence without visibility. Structure without exposure. Networks without clear boundaries. And when you combine that idea with modern examples of private influence, overlapping interests, and limited transparency, you don't get a single answer. You get a framework. One that explains why certain patterns repeat. One that explains why some systems are difficult to fully understand from the outside. And one that leads directly into the next layer of this story. Because if influence is shaped early, then the next question is where those individuals are first connected, first selected, and first brought into those networks. That leads to places like Skull and Bones, and that is where things become even more structured. If this made you question how power actually works, then you're starting to see the pattern. But this doesn't stop here. Because if networks like this exist, then the real question is where they begin. And that leads to places most people never look. The next episode goes deeper. Subscribe, and I'll see you there.